This is part 2 of a 4-part Broken Money series based on Lynn Alden's Broken Money book. We extracted the big ideas, removed the confusing financial jargon, and created a short 4-part series with animated videos. The 4-part series answers 4 questions. Part 1, what is money? Part 2, who creates, controls, and manipulates money? Part 3, how is money created, controlled, and manipulated? Part 4, what's next? Who creates and controls money? To really understand who is behind the creation and control money, we need to take a stroll down memory lane. By examining a thread of history, we're able to see the creation and control of money repeatedly captured, controlled, and manipulated time and time again. So this is the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC, over 2,000 years ago. At its height, the Roman Empire covered much of Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. It was a time marked by rapid expansion and prosperity, cultural change, and architectural and engineering innovation. Yet it was also a time of significant centralization of power, political tension amongst ambitious and greedy rulers, and mass conflict and war. What does it mean to be an empire? In short, empires have a centralized authority or governing system that exerts and expands its control over other territories or nations, sometimes through diplomacy, but usually through military force and conflict. In order for an empire to centralize and expand, it often needs to maintain and control a unified money and economic system. In other words, it needs to take control of the purse strings. Different empires, nations, and countries have been overlapping, intertwining, merging, and destroying each other, themselves, and their financial systems since the dawn of time. Here we have the silver denarius and the gold aureus coins. These coins were the backbone of the Roman financial system. The government minted and distributed these coins, providing citizens with a consistent medium of exchange and giving the government a centralized currency for tax collection. But an empire the size of Rome has an ever-growing list of expenses: natural disasters and cities in need of repair. Roman emperors and their notoriously lavish entourages funding grand feasts, celebrations, and gigantic statues. And most notably, and costly, constant wars required fighting, while borders needed defending. During the expansion of the Roman Empire, tax revenue covered some of the costs, but not all of the costs. When an empire runs low on money, there are a few options on the table. Slow expansion and increase productivity, increase taxation, borrow money from someone else. As you might have guessed, under the rule of ambitious leaders with wars to fight, statues to build, and great fiestas to fund, slowing expansion isn't a favorable option. Neither is hiking taxes, so the Roman Empire opted for a different option. They debased their currency. By reducing the metal content in the coins, the government could create more of them. Imagine having 100 gold coins worth $1 each, $100 total. You then cut the amount of gold in each coin by half and create 200 gold coins, still worth $1 each, $200 total. Same amount of gold, double the number of coins. Genius. This is precisely what the Roman Empire did and continued to do. Today, our governments and central banks aren't constrained by the need to debase physical coins or even print notes. With a simple click, bank balances can magically increase without limitation. But let's stick to the story of the Romans for now. We'll discuss the modern alchemy of debasement, money printing, and their sinister sibling, debt, later in the essay. This graph here shows the amount of grams of silver per denarius coin from 200 BC to 300 AD. Some emperors, like the great Marcus Aurelius, worked to preserve the integrity of the denarius despite Rome's economic challenges. But he was fighting a losing battle. Over several centuries, Roman rulers continually debased their currencies to fund war and lavish projects, until major debasements under the rule of greedy chaps like Emperor Nero sent the empire on an irreversible downward spiral. By minting so many coins with reducing amounts of metal, political instability grew, innovation stopped, and the public lost faith in the government's ability to manage the money. Economic turmoil led to widespread conflict, famine, disease, instability, and ultimately, the fall of the Roman Empire. A brief history of the creation and control of money. In the previous essay, we discussed that money isn't an easy thing to grasp. That's because it hasn't always been a real thing. Sometimes it was a real thing, other times it was sort of a real thing. And now, well, it's really not a thing at all. Let's explain what that actually means. Humans keep records of who owes who what. It's fundamental to human existence, and it's as old as the chimps. Money is really just a changing representation of the record of who owes who what. A ledger. Sometimes the ledger is the actual thing itself, created and limited by nature's production. For example, you and I can swap shells or gold to square a deal right here and now. The shells and gold are both the money and the ledger. Owning them is the record of who owes who what. Nature produces them, and ultimately is the creator of money. Other times, the commodity is captured and controlled by a centralized entity and then reformed, redistributed, and often manipulated. The commodity still represents the record of who owes who what and is originally created by nature. But it's ultimately controlled and can be manipulated by the centralized entity as gold and silver were by the Roman government. And then there are times when nature's commodity money is captured, controlled, and then completely removed, so that it no longer represents the record of who owes who what. It is replaced by anything the centralized entity wants to call money, like IOUs, banknotes, or numbers on a screen. The ledger can be manipulated or changed without limitation, and if the new imaginary money lasts long enough, people forget there ever was a real thing in the first place. So whoever captures an existing money controls the ledger, and whoever controls the ledger has the ability to manipulate that money and then eventually replace it with something else that isn't a real thing at all. To fully grasp why this is such a big deal, it helps to zoom out and track the transfer of power over time, and how this transfer led to the capture and control of money and money creation over and over again. From shells and beads to the rise of European colonial empires, rolling back the clock nearly 100,000 years, we find evidence of sophisticated uses of things like shells to represent the record of who owes who what. Things like shells and beads were used to keep tabs of who owed who what. Because shells and beads were products of nature, and no one had developed the ability to control all beads and shells in existence, the shells, and later gold, were used as money, but were controlled by nature. Fast forward to the Roman Empire. Here too, initially, nature controlled the ledger. It produced the silver and gold, and the silver and gold were made into coins, which were the record of who owed who what. Once the gold and silver was captured, turned into coins and controlled by the Roman government, things started sliding into chaos. Even under capture and control, had the coins always maintained their original value in metal, then the ledger would still have been controlled in some part by nature. But as soon as the money was captured and debased, gold and silver removed, the Roman government and ruling entities hijacked the ledger from both nature and the ordinary folk. If you zoom out far enough, you can see this story on repeat. Growing empires capturing control of the existing natural resource used as money, and then manipulating that money, often to finance military expansion. This was almost always the prelude to the collapse of every such civilization, kingdom, nation, and country on the face of the planet, since the very beginning of time right up to today, from ancient Egypt and the Shang dynasty to the rise and fall of the Romans and the Persians, from the Mongol and Byzantine empires to the great European nations of colonial conquest. If you take one thread of history, the rise of colonial European empires through to the rise of the current global empire, the US, you see the story of centralization unfold time and time again. From European conquest to the US global order, during the 1400s, after the devastation of the Black Death, European nations began their quests of colonial expansion through conquest and extraction. Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands spread throughout Africa, Atlantic islands, the Americas, and many other regions, extracting resources and destroying cultures like the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans. There were repeated conflicts between Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. In addition to conquest, most of these nations went to war with themselves and with each other. They allied with and fought against each other, and when that wasn't enough, they swapped teams and went to war with each other again. The US was established and eventually fought its war of independence for sovereignty from its British overlords. Military expansion and conquest wasn't a cheap affair. To bankroll their expansion, European nations repeatedly captured control of and debased their currencies. Conflict between European superpowers came to a head in the early 1900s. Britain had established itself as the financial and military superpower of the world, but there was growing tension as it locked horns with Germany. To win the war, Britain needed more money. So it did what all global empires do to ensure the continued expansion, debased its currency. Prior to the war, banknotes were golden tickets, literally. They were redeemable for an equal amount of gold. People trusted the banks. It made sense for them to store their gold and then transact using banknotes and checks. But in 1914, as the war drums began beating, the banks and government revoked on their promise, outlawed ownership of gold and stopped people converting their banknotes back into gold. And unlike the Romans, who needed to alter the physical metal content within their coins, the Brits now had the magic money printer. They even tried taking a loan from the public in the form of war bonds to finance war, but they flopped. Rather than announce there was no support for the war, they rugged the public by printing and slipping some extra cash to their friends at the central bank, who purchased the bonds, and made it look as though the public had done so. The Allied forces eventually won a long and grueling war, yet even victors of war have a price to pay. Allied nations fell into significant post-war depression, economic turmoil, debt, political and social unrest, unemployment. The rise of the new global world order, one ledger to rule them all, and the Federal Reserve. The US stood relatively unharmed by the damages of war, thanks to geography, early neutrality and economic interests. It had also played lender to a lot of the Allied nations, and gradually accumulated a lot of the world's gold supplies in return. This marked the transfer of the world's most powerful ledger into the hands of the budding and current global empire, the USA. Over the course of the next 100 years, its status as global reserve currency and its position as the strongest military force and empire grew. The US empire increased its stranglehold over the world's gold supplies and thus became the keeper of the ultimate ledger, the record of who owed who what, for the entire world. It continually manipulated that money through debasement and eventually removed the gold backing completely, replacing it with a magic money no longer backed or constrained by nature. When considering the rise of the US global world order, there are two main players to consider. One is the US government, and the other is the US central bank, the Fed. Here is a list of some of the major events which help explain how money and the ledger was captured, controlled and replaced over time in the US. The Banking Crisis and the Federal Reserve Act, 1913. Prior to World War I and the rise of the US as the global superpower, a major banking crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of the US financial system. As a result, the Federal Reserve, the Fed, was established in the US as an attempt to prevent these events from unfolding in the future, bestowing the Fed with mighty authority to print US dollars and set interest rates. When the Fed was established way back in 1913, its initial goal was to provide the country with a stable financial system and act as the lender of last resort. Over time, however, the Fed's power continually expanded until its stranglehold over the ledger was so tight there was no turning back. World War I, 1916. The US entered World War I in 1917, only a few years after the Federal Reserve was established. The Fed played a significant role in helping finance the war effort. It facilitated the sale of war bonds and provided loans at preferential rates to banks purchasing treasury certificates. In other words, it printed money and encouraged banks to loan money to the government to fund war and loan to other countries. The US and the Fed were also able to capture a significant portion of the world's gold. Stock market crash and the Great Depression, 1929. After the World War I, while other countries weathered the shitstorm of post-war depression, the US entered a period of economic growth, the Roaring Twenties. Everyone got a bit too greedy. Excessive spending and speculation led to a big crash which triggered the Great Depression. The recently established Fed, whose primary goal was to provide a stable financial system, was widely criticized for not only failing to prevent the crash, but actually contributing to it. Widespread bank failures, business closures, high unemployment rates, and an all-round horrible time for the majority of US citizens was the result. The Banking Act, 1935. After the Great Depression, a board of members were elected, the FOMC. Even though the Fed had failed to prevent the crisis leading to the Great Depression, they were given full authority to change bank reserve requirements and manage banks going forward. In simpler terms, the Act ensured all major decisions about US money and banking were made centrally by the Federal Reserve rather than individual commercial banks. And the Fed now had more control to step in and print more money to bail out big banks. World War II and the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1939. Many countries entered total war mode, while their governments exerted full control over their country's ledgers in preparation for World War II. This led to significant economic downturns and ever-increasing debt levels. After the war, the US government convinced a number of countries to fix their exchange rate to the US dollar, which was backed by gold, the Bretton Woods Agreement. The aim was to foster international economic stability and cooperation. The US dollar was now effectively the world's primary reserve currency. Everyone agreed to this under the presumption that the US dollar would be backed by gold. The Treasury-Fed Accord, 1951. During World War II, the Fed agreed to maintain low interest rates to help finance war. As a result, after the war, the Treasury-Fed Accord was passed, freeing the Fed to pursue anti-inflationary policy. In other words, the government gave the Fed full permission to create and remove money to control inflation. The Nixon shock, 1971. After establishing the Bretton Woods Agreement 30 years earlier, the US was under increasing pressure to maintain adequate gold to back their global currency. World War II had been expensive. There were internal economic pressures and foreign countries were increasingly selling their US dollars. The US position as the global empire and monetary superpower was under threat. So President Nixon and the Fed suspended US dollars from being converted back into gold and officially ended the gold standard for good. Previously, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, participating countries were pegged at a fixed amount to the US dollar, which was backed by gold. When Nixon and the Fed revoked on the gold standard, the value of foreign-tied currencies was now floating, determined by supply and demand in the foreign exchange market. Thanks to the US having 20-plus years as the most widely held and used currency, one of the largest economies and widespread political and military influence, it remained the preferred and most popular currency for other countries to hold and use when transacting with each other. There are also some less publicly discussed reasons for the US maintaining its position as global superpower, such as the emergence of the petrodollar and developing world debt increased the Fed's power and influence to global reach. The petrodollar system, 1974. OPEC is the group of Arab nations who produce most of the world's oil. In the early 1970s, they weren't very happy with the US for some of its military involvement in the Middle East, so they stopped sending oil. This massively impacted major economies around the world. Oil became super scarce and expensive, and the US dollar was again under threat. US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was shipped off to the Middle East, where he struck a deal with Saudi Arabia by convincing them to price their oil exclusively in US dollars in return for military support. This series of agreements with the Saudis created the petrodollar system and ensured there was consistent global demand for the US dollar. What would happen if there was no need to use the US dollar to purchase oil? Developing Third World Debt, 1970s today. During the 1970s, there was rapid increase in world population, increasing resource scarcity, especially in third world and developing countries. Following the war, newly independent nations were attempting to modernize and industrialize. They needed to borrow money, they needed fuel, and the oil crisis had made the situation worse. They were forced to borrow substantial sums of money from the US. Major commercial banks such as JP Morgan, Citibank, and Bank of America were eager to make up for recent economic downturns and losses caused by the oil crisis. They were more than happy to extend loans to the developing countries. The debts of these third world countries became unmanageable, rendering them perpetually indebted to the US. Often corrupt leadership within these developing countries and mismanaged loan terms worsened the situation. They were basically left with debt they could never pay back for loans they never received. While this ensured consistent demand for US dollars, it had devastating economic and social consequences for countries in the Soviet bloc, Central and South America, and many other developing nations, including Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Nigeria, and the Philippines. Early 1980s recession, 1981. The early 1980s recession was another tough period for the economy. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, decided to make borrowing money more expensive to combat rising prices of goods, inflation. This action demonstrated the Fed's further control over the economy. Black Monday, 1987. Black Monday refers to a day when stock prices fell dramatically worldwide. The Federal Reserve stepped in by making more money available in the financial system, aiming to prevent further panic and stabilize the economy. International financial crises: Mexico, 1994, and Asia, 1997. During the 90s, the Federal Reserve extended its influence beyond the US during financial crises. In the Mexican peso crisis, the Fed, along with the US government, organized financial aid for Mexico. Similarly, during the Asian financial crisis, the Fed collaborated with other central banks to manage the crisis. These events underscored the Fed's evolving role in international financial stability, demonstrating its ability to coordinate responses to financial crises on a global scale. Both situations drew heavy criticism, highlighting the fact the US intervention worsened the situation and could be, at least partly, blamed for the crisis happening in the first place. The financial crisis, 2008. The Great Recession of 2008 came as the result, again, of banks lending too much money. Housing prices soared, creating a bubble. When the bubble burst, people defaulted on their loans, setting off a chain reaction, leading to a broader financial crisis. The banks had irresponsibly loaned and then bundled loans into financial products to sell and make themselves more money on top of the loan interest. When people couldn't afford to pay their mortgages, the value of these products plummeted, causing massive losses for financial institutions and triggering a global financial crisis. To address this, the Fed started implementing some of the more interesting money magic tricks of the modern era. In addition to lowering interest rates to near zero in an attempt to re-stimulate growth, they commenced quantitative easing. This is a fancy way of saying the Fed created new magic money that didn't exist to buy things from banks, aiming to encourage these banks to lend more money to people and businesses to help boost economic activity. Those worst impacted by the actions of big banks were the smaller commercial banks, businesses and consumers like you and me. The Fed's response focused essentially on bailing out the big banks. If you're confused, just know that you're not alone. It's a confusing mess. In the next essay, we'll break down how the central bank manipulates money, and the differences between money printing and quantitative easing will make more sense. COVID-19. Response, 2020. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed again slashed interest rates to near zero. Unlike the 2008 crisis, where the primary concern was stabilizing banks, this time, the broader economy was at risk as millions lost jobs and businesses faced going bankrupt. The government unleashed a torrent of spending, sending out stimulus checks, beefing up unemployment benefits, and financing loans to small businesses, partially bailing out some hard-hit industries. To cover this spending, the Fed again created new money out of thin air to buy Treasury securities issued by the government. So, in simpler terms, the government and the Fed worked together to send money directly to people's pockets and keep businesses afloat. Rising world debt, 2023. The US has now crossed $33 trillion in debt. That is 12 zeros. This is the amount of borrowed money the US government needs to pay back to a variety of lenders, not including interest. This table shows the US growing debt since the 1970s. Debt isn't inherently bad, but it becomes problematic when a country's debt levels are growing at a rate far outpacing what it is producing and earning, GDP. If a country is earning and producing economic growth at a rate outpacing the amount it is borrowing and spending, it is in a better position to manage its debt. Through taxation, it can pay down its debt, or at least pay the interest on the debt it owes. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. US national debt is the highest it has ever been, and its debt-to-GDP ratio recently crossed its highest levels since World War II. As we learned from the Romans and every empire throughout the course of history, when a country runs out of money, there aren't many options left on the table. Slowing growth and increasing taxation aren't very popular at the polling booth. So elected US governments, in partnership with the Fed, have been doing what they do best, especially over the past 50 or so years: debasing the currency by printing money. From the modern era, the 1980s onwards, financial crisis, COVID, and the US's ever-increasing social and military spending have skyrocketed. There have been recurring failed attempts to tame inflation and fix poor banking practices, so the government has needed to print more and more money. Though given a colourful variety of fancy names over the years, quantitative easing, open market operations, asset purchase programs, they are essentially the same thing: money printing. Just as the Romans devalued the amount of metal in their coins, the US government is devaluing the amount of worth in the dollar, but on a much grander scale. Here you can see the relative purchasing power of the US dollar over the last 100 years. A disturbing realization is that debt cannot just continue to rise. We still haven't seen the full effect of recent COVID spending, while geopolitical tensions, military and social spending are rising. It's looking less and less likely there will be an easy way out of this mess. There is no denying we are toward the end of a long-term debt cycle and potential crisis. It's anyone's guess as to what happens over the coming years, and will depend largely on how the government reacts to address the situation. Where does this leave us now? Who creates and controls money today? As we've explored, keeping a record of who owes who, what is fundamental to human existence. On the long arc of history, we can see that as human civilizations expand and empires emerge, they do so by taking control of whatever existing commodity is used as money, and the record of who owes who what. Once they control that money and ledger, they have the ability to create a new money no longer controlled or balanced by nature. The current US empire has done exactly this, capturing and controlling the existing natural money and ledger, gold, and changing the rules by replacing it with an imaginary ledger and money. But this time we have a truly global empire. Everyone is connected, and the debasement of money has been happening without limitation. The US has increased money creation and debt to unimaginable levels, while constructing a broken and complicated financial system in an attempt to patch an ultimately doomed money. So who creates and controls money today? The short surface-level answer is the US government and the US central bank, the Fed, create and control money. The US central bank is supposed to exist separately to the US government, but in reality, the separation is thin. The central bank's board of directors are elected by the government. The longer answer is not so simple. While the US central bank under government direction has ultimate control over the ledger and creation and distribution of money, it is influenced directly and indirectly by a number of external entities with competing interests. A smaller number of large financial institutions, public and private entities and organizations exert significant influence over the central bank and the government, and subsequently sit very close to the creation and control of money. Some of them include financial institutions with global operations like JP Chase, investment management firms like BlackRock, technology companies like Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, major war material and ammunition suppliers like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, multinational pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, and a slew of other Goliath energy, automaker and consumer companies. In the next essay, we'll unpack how money is controlled and manipulated, and the layers of organization and influence will start to make more sense. Please subscribe over at Prometheus.com and get these essays and animated videos directly to your inbox.